A woman catches a stranger at her brother's grave, then realizes what he had done to her family. Hello everybody and welcome back to our channel. Before we get started, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe for more content. The death of a loved one is never an easy pill to swallow, yet it becomes even more of an emotional roller coaster when you spend the rest of your life trying to discover more about someone you love that a heart you don't know at all. True words have never summed up the life of Kear, a woman approaching her 80s who had devoted the last 70 years of her life to her dead brother. She had been trying to uncover the mystery surrounding not only his past, but also the relationships that he had that would link him to the strange occurrences she had been observing at his grave for decades. Kear's lifelong journey filled with tragedy and pain started one day when she was just 7 years old, one where she and her family discovered the painful news about the death of her brother. He was just a teenager when the worst happened. He drowned when on a scouting trip back in 1947. The details were vivid. At Oxwish Bay near Swansea in 1947, Anne's brother met his early death when, unbeknownst to the Scout team leader, he and a few of the other boys had decided to take a detour to a lake. Unfortunately, after treading the murky waters, Anne's brother got caught up in the depths of the lake's water and wound up drowning. The news tore through the family like a razor-sharp knife. Even though Anne was just 7 at the time and did not have many vivid memories of her brother's life up to that point, she felt the blow of the loss just as powerfully as their own mother did. It was painful to know that in the blink of an eye she had lost her one and only brother. While she wasn't able to attend the funeral, needless to say, her brother's passing left an indelible mark on her and a sense of grief that never seemed to go away. Ever since she was a child, she would visit his grave in order to remember him and pay her respects. Yet from the very beginning, she started noticing strange things happening at his grave. From an early age, when Anne would visit her brother's final resting place, she took note of a series of peculiar occurrences. When she went, typically she would rest flowers on the grave. However, when she came back the next time expecting to see her wilted flowers laying where she last left them, she would be perpetually perplexed. As a little girl, Anne would return to her brother's grave to find not only the wilted petals of her parting gifts to her brother, but also another set of fresh flowers neatly decorated on his gravestone that she didn't put there. What could be going on? Judging by the way in which the flowers had been arranged, it was clear that the culprit behind the flower placements was someone who cared for her brother. That, coupled with the fact that they weren't left just once or twice, rather every time she would visit the gravestone, the discoveries confused her. Who could be the person doing this? When Anne relayed the news to her mother and sister, initially they were a bit taken aback. Initially, they assumed that the flowers or petals of a nearby tree had somehow blown across her brother's tombstone. However, when they finally witnessed with their own eyes the precision and placement as well as the frequency of the flower's appearance as Anne described, they figured that they knew who it was. Upon observing the flower placement, Anne's mother came to the conclusion that it had to be one of the elderly residents that was behind the act. It wasn't difficult to come up with that hypothesis. Actually, her son had been a favorite among the elderly. He would oftentimes spend time with them to show them that they were appreciated. However, after conversing with a few suspected senior citizens in her neighborhood who knew nothing about the frequent flower drop-offs, she soon came to the realization that perhaps it may not have been as her assumptions led her to believe. However, Anne's mother did not think much of it and the family continued with their lives. That was until another series of strange occurrences found their way to Anne's brother's tombstone. After a few months of getting accustomed to the flowers that were spread over his grave, Anne's family discovered another strange emblem left on Karl's tombstone. It was something that left all members of the family stunned, something that none of them could have ever predicted. Strewn about the tombstone, Anne came across a series of handwritten letters addressed to none other than her dead brother Karl. Now, not only did they have flowers to contend with, but they also had letters. The question remained, who was the author behind them? As they weighed the evidence, they assumed that the person who had been leaving Flower all this time was also the same person who had written the letters. However, they soon realized that the perpetrators may not even be the same person. What if there were two people who had decided to publicly display their affection for Karl? What was really going on? Still, despite the perpetual doubts and never-ending questions that haunted Anne's family for years, they never got an answer. Eventually, they just had to get accustomed to the new arrivals that would land on Karl's grave, neatly packaged and reflective of someone who cared deeply for him. Anne's mother would later pass away without ever learning who the mastermind was. But what about Anne? While Anne's mother would not come to unmask the author behind the poems or the person who religiously delivered flowers to her son's grave, Anne was determined to find out. She could not fathom how, despite years of searching for an answer, she couldn't figure out who the person was. No matter how many times she asked for help, she just wasn't able to get any leads. How long would this go on? All of Anne's attempts to uncover the truth about the mystery visitor were futile. For decades, she visited her brother's grave only to find the remnants of the visitor scattered over his tombstone. No matter how many public pleas she made, she never got a response. That was until one day, help came knocking on her doorstep. It took Anne 70 years of searching to finally get a lead that might help put an end to her plight. That lead was Camilla Rose. Camilla is a BBC journalist who came across Anne's remarkable story. She was immediately attracted to the mix of tragedy and mystery that shrouded Anne's life since she was a child, and she figured that she had to step in to get her some help. But could she? Camilla promptly got in touch with Anne to meet in person so that the two of them could solve the mystery together. As soon as they met, the two instantly connected. At least Anne had found someone with whom she had shared her obsession for the mysterious grave visitor. And at last, Camilla was in the presence of the woman whose life story had touched her deeply. It was then that Anne began to open up about her life as she had never before. During their first meeting, Anne was quite candid about her brother's passing, as a tear rolled down her cheek. She recalled how he had drowned in the lake. She also remembered her mother's grief. But most of all, she reminisced on how the recurring mystery person that always visited her brother's grave kept her from truly getting over her childhood tragedy. It was clear Camilla had to put her journalism skills to the test, but where would they start first? After some thought, Camilla and Anne determined that it was probably best to look at the persons who were there the day that Karl died. Maybe it might have been one of his old friends who had witnessed his death. The ladies hadn't the finest clue. All they knew was that they had to start looking. Where would be the first place that they check out? To kick off their hunt, Camilla and Anne set off the archive center where Karl's case had been filed. There, they were able to go through his official death documents and identify who was there the day he died. There, Anne was able to see photos of the incident that she had never seen before. What would her reaction be like? And surprisingly, witnessing photos of her brother's lifeless body was hard on Anne. She was too young to remember things clearly, but she did know that she had loved her brother dearly. However, and as saddening as it was to see his dead body, she took solace in the fact that she felt that she and Camilla were finally going to get some closure on a story that had haunted her life for 70 years. Having created a list of possible suspects, they started contacting them one by one. Anne and Camilla were sure that their search would have brought them somewhere. It was most logical after all. The theory that it had been an elderly person from the start had to be discarded because clearly, after 70 years of non-stop delivery, it had to have been someone who had a longer life expectancy. What would her contacts tell her? When Camilla took up the mantle and started calling, she was hopeful. However, she couldn't hide her disappointment when call after call was negative. Some of the men who were there that day did not even recall who Camilla was talking about. Her hopes began to dim and her chances of solving the mystery looked gloomier. Then, they did some digging and found a bit of information that would point them in the right direction. As Camilla and Anne went through the pile of evidence they had amassed, they spotted something that would change the route of the investigation. There, at the bottom of one of the many beautifully written poems, they saw something scribbled. What could it be? There, they discovered the initials of someone's name, one which matched the initials of one of the old boys that Karl had gone to school with, one whom they hadn't got around to contacting. Camilla and Anne's hopes lifted. Would this be the clue that would change their lives for good and solve the mystery that had stained the very fabric of their minds for so long? On the other line, Camilla was greeted by a warm voice, so warm that it sounded almost familiar to her despite the fact that she had never met the speaker. Camilla questioned the man about Karl, and to her surprise, he was very much aware of him. However, it still had to be proven, was this the man they were looking for? To their grand disappointment, when Camilla pressed the speaker as to whether he was the one who had been visiting Karl's grave all those years, the response was surroundingly negative. He claimed to have never gone to Karl's last resting place since the funeral 70 years prior. Camilla and Anne were back to square one. If only they knew that they were closer to the mystery man than they ever were. Camilla and Anne were back to where they started, with a lot of leads that seemed to go nowhere. However, they were not about to give up. They knew that the answers were there, they just had to find them, so they did the most logical thing that anyone would do. And surprisingly, Camilla and Anne decided that it was time to comb through the evidence once more. Perhaps this time they would have found something that they hadn't given much thought to. Yeah, once again they turned up with nothing. That was, however, until Camilla came up with a brilliant idea. As Camilla reviewed the letters, she couldn't help but feel that there was more to the poetic written than might meet the eye. They were no experts on poetry, but they realized that most of the poems treated the same themes. They were also brilliantly written. Could it be that the mystery man is a prolific writer? There was no telling for sure, but Camilla knew exactly what she had to do next. With high hopes and big dreams, Camilla made her way to Stephen Regan, a professor of English literature of Durham University. There she presented him with the letters found at Karl's grave. As Stephen pursued the content, he furrowed his eyebrows. Then he had a look of pure shock on his face. What was going on through his mind? Being a well-read man, Stephen Regan was quick to assimilate the text and make conclusions. One poem titled The Lost Ship, for example, was addressed to sailors who had lost their lives at sea, a clear parallel to Karl's tragic end as he drowned in a lake. That said, there was one particular poem that stood out to the professor. Stephen Regan was quick to point out something that both Camilla and Anne had overlooked. When reading one of the poems, he recognized a series of quotes incorporated into the author's penned work from another, more famous poet A.E. Housman, the English classic poet who wrote the critically acclaimed piece To an Athlete Dying Young. What could these references mean? The reference to the famous poem signaled off several alarm bells for Stephen Regan. On one hand, the inclusion of the text was appropriate, as in much the same way that Karl died young. So too does the poem speak about the fleetingness of youth. However, the author was also modifying those texts to make them more personal to Karl. Then another observation was made. Upon doing some further research, Stephen was able to unearth some interesting information about one of the poet references that was made. He discovered that one of them had attended the same school as Karl, enrolling several years prior to his death. Having ruled out that the person who quoted the famous English writers couldn't be the same person to Stephen, it could only mean one thing. Stephen came up with the ingenious hypothesis that while Karl may not have known A.E. Housman personally, as is customary in schools, it's possible that the prolific writer was admired and revered by students who came in his wake, as they would both at some point in time form the college's alma mater community. Therefore, that meant one thing. According to Stephen, it is plausible that the author behind the mysterious writings went to the same school as Karl and was around the same age. That would explain why the references were so personal to the school, as well as how the writer would get the idea to quote alumni in the poems. With the information in mind, Stephen urged them to keep looking. What would this mean for Camilla and Anne? Camilla and Anne returned to the drawing board, bristling with the fervor. They were onto something, which old schoolmate had they forgotten to contact. They believed that they had checked them all. Then it hit her. Camilla would go on to recount that in the official files she unearthed at the archives, she read that at the camping trip, Karl had sharped a camper with another boy whose name was Ronald. Both had gone to the same school and were around the same age, however, in contact with him despite her multiple calls. When Camilla called, her emotions were at an all-time high. Could this man finally put an end to her and Anne's wild goose chase that had plagued the latter for 70 whole years? Ronald picked up the phone and Camilla went cold. After exchanging pleasantries, she asked the million-dollar question. What would he say? To Camilla's amazement, Ronald stated that he was indeed the one who had been visiting Karl's grave all those years. It was as if an incredible weight had finally been lifted off of Camilla and Anne's shoulders. They had finally found the mystery man 70 years later. The question was, why? After a mutually agreed upon decision to meet in person, Ronald and Anne were able to discuss a past that the two of them unknowingly shared for 70 years. Ronald explained that he was devastated by Karl's passing as a child. Ever since then, he made a vow never to forget him. For that reason, he frequently visits Karl's grave in memory of a young man who really did die too young. Needless to say, Anne was so relieved knowing that she had finally found the answer that she had been longing for. Now, having shared with each other the pain both of them kept inside, the two now go to Karl's grave together, developing a ritual and friendship bounded not just by Karl's death, but by the need to remember him.